My name is Claus, and this is my video out. So I'm born in Denmark. I grew up in Denmark. I'm the youngest of four brothers, and had a pretty happy, healthy growing up. Trained in the furniture business because my dream was to work with furniture and interior design. The company I worked for had a shop in England. So when I graduated from the business school, they offered me a job in England. So I packed my bags at the ripe old age of 19. I packed my bags and moved to England. Then had a great time there, loved living there. But after about 4 years, I thought it was time for me to do something else. And really at that time, I thought it was time to go back to school and do some further educations. So my parents dutifully sent me the Sunday paper from Copenhagen every week. And I found an ad for a job in Phoenix, Arizona. That would be more like looking for a needle in a haystack. So I applied for that job and got it. So I packed my bags once again, and rather than going back to Denmark, I got on a plane and arrived in Phoenix, Arizona. That was on a 18 months work visa. So after 18 months, I could no longer stay, but I was offered a job by one of the companies that supplied the store there, offered me a job that put me back in Copenhagen because that's where I would be headquartered out of. But I, for all practical purposes, lived in the United States and traveled as a manufacturer's rep all over the States, mainly the western part, pretty much Mississippi and west of there. So that was a great experience. I got to visit every state, practically every capital, and had a wonderful time in and out of airports and rental cars and hotels. And it was a pretty cool job to do on somebody else's dime. And apparently I was quite good at it because they asked me to come to Norfolk, Virginia, and open a warehouse. And that's really how I ended up being in Norfolk. I came here in 1975. I was supposed to be here for just a few weeks to set up the warehouse, hire some staff, and get it up and running. And after about 3 months, I called my boss and I said, have I moved to Norfolk and I just don't know it yet? And they were like, well, that might be a really, really good idea if you don't mind. So I said, well, pack up my stuff in Santa Monica and ship it out here, and I'll now live in Norfolk. So sort of funny side story to that, when they told me to go to Norfolk, I was in Denmark spending Christmas with my parents, and I literally had to go to the bookcase, pull out the World Atlas, find a map of the United States, find Virginia, and find Norfolk. I had no idea where it was, other than I knew it was on the East Coast. So that's kind of the very brief story of how I got here.
Wow.
And here I am, 43 years later, I'm still living and loving it here. My coming out story is really a little bit more of a story of evolvement. I always grew up knowing that I was going to find and marry the perfect girl and have a family and raise a family because I just knew that was my calling. But relationships never quite worked out right, other than I had a tendency to part as friends. See, that should have been a clue. So I did get married, and we, out of that relationship, we have a beautiful son, but it just didn't seem to quite work right. So we went our separate ways, and in my travels, I really kind of lived in a little bit of a vacuum. Nobody was looking at me, nobody was seeing me. So as I suddenly realized that I was probably really, really attracted to men rather than women, I had a very secure environment to experiment in because, as I said, nobody was looking. I didn't have to worry about who had seen me, who I might be accountable to. So over a period of about 6-7 months, I probably realized that hanging out with guys was really more my scene. And then over a period, I started developing more long-term friendships. My first long-term relationship happened here in Norfolk, about a year after I arrived here.
And that was in 1975.
I got here in 75, and about a year and a half later, I met a great guy by the name of Vernon Middleton. Everybody knew him as Buzzy, and we just formed a fast friendship. Classic story, actually. We went on a first date and pretty much was never apart for after that. So it's a really cool story. But after that first date, we pretty much spent all the time together as much as at all possible, and we became great friends and you know, great partners, great lovers, and that lasted until he passed away in 1988. He unfortunately was one of the early victims if you want to use the term victim, but he was one of the first people that passed away in this area with AIDS. So I lived that story from the early 80s until he passed away. Our story really started. We were on vacation in Mexico, and Buzzy got the flu. And we got back and he just couldn't kick the flu. It would probably have been like 81, probably around 1981, maybe 82. He just could not get over this flu, and he kept going to the doctor. And meanwhile, in the late 70s and early 80s, you would read the stories about this gay plague that was happening to people in New York and San Francisco and places like that. And we were like, but we don't live in a big city like that, so that doesn't really apply to us. Except more and more symptoms felt like there's something else going on here. And Buzzy really very, very diligently pursued conversations with every doctor that had knowledge in that field. Because remember, back then, there was no expert to turn to. There was all learning as things evolved. So we went a number of trips to Sloan Kettering in New York for consultations there, and the first real knowledge was that he had a greatly compromised immune system. And then I guess it was, what, 85 when they finally identified and found a way to test for the virus, and he tested positive. Um, Very, very aggressively sought every treatment that was available at that time. He was in one of the first experimental treatments of ATZ, I think it was. And eventually, as is often the case, what actually ended up taking him was pneumonia and organ failure. Because of all the medication he'd been taking for several years, his organs started failing and just couldn't fight the infection. So, and that was just a very, very difficult time, because you also realized that friends and acquaintances were affected and infected, and there was entirely too many funerals. It's come a long way since then. I was very nervous. It was scary, because you were experimenting with something that what, in my case, I had never done before, and that I was taught was wrong. Although I'm probably somewhat lucky. My parents were fairly liberal, but I still knew through school and teaching that having love and sex for another man was wrong. So in that sense, it was quite scary. But then you wake up the next morning, you realize that the sky didn't fall, that you actually feel pretty good about yourself, and and um, and you really sort of feel relieved that you have found out a way that now you can be your true self. That moment does evolve, at least for me, did evolve over a long period of time. It probably evolved from my first male to male relationship until I was completely comfortable. Probably lasted a couple of years before I got completely comfortable. I still think it might have been a phase I was going through, but I'm sure you heard that before. Now, I grew up in a small town called Vejle on the east coast of Jutland. So I grew up probably about 150 miles west of Copenhagen. And there was no LGBTQ community. I don't think the term existed in anybody's mind at that time. I mean, certainly it existed, but not anything that anybody would have talked about. So, so, um, so my only exposure growing up was really through some Danish literature would have books and novels that also included some same-sex relationships, and that was really my only exposure growing up. In growing up, it really didn't come up. I don't recall any reference until maybe I was in my mid-teens, until about maybe 16, 17, where somebody would say, "Oh, he's a little," and do a limp wrist symbol, and I was like, "What does that mean?" But there was no growing up. There was no strong anti-gay language in the circles I affiliated with, that I associated with.
Tell
I
me
I,
about
I, I I think when you start putting labels on people, you're boxing them into kind of a narrow field of development, and the less we put labels on people, the more you allow them to develop in their own way and be their best and fullest self that they can be. I would say that you're really wasting your life. This is not a rehearsal. I mean, to think for a minute about the potential of what they could be and what they're denying themselves for being in a closet, I think that's just it's a terrible way to live. It's basically imprisoning your soul. They are also doing, I think, certainly the gay community, if not the community at large, a big disservice, because we get to know who you pretend to be. We don't get to know who you really are. And I think we're all better people if we know who we truly are, and kind of develop our strengths, and can support our weaknesses.
yeah.
So what I would say to that person is it's time to grow up and come out, and start living your life. And I would say that whether they were 18 or whether they were 80, I would say the same thing. Just you don't know how much time you have on this earth, so you better enjoy it and be the best you can be. If First of all, I think there's many people in that situation where it's very difficult for them to come up because of family ties, and how they were raised, and they're sure that they'll go to hell, if they come out and live their true self. Um, but again, we all have choices, and I would say to them, you just need to look at what your choices are, what your options are. And if they're living in a environment that is very hostile to them, get out. You know, Figure out who your friends are and have them help you get out of that environment. You don't need to be there. It's not really. I mean, I don't think it's that different than when you read about people being in an abusive relationship, and that can be gay, straight, or otherwise. But I mean, if you live in any kind of abusive relationship, you just need to get out. You just don't stay. Might be fatal. It can be very tough for some people to get out. You know, you read stories about people that teenagers that escape home, but then they have nowhere to go, so they end up on the street, and then they end up being taken advantage of. So that's a pretty terrible situation to get into. So the other thing I would say to anybody is, when you get out, make sure you have an escape plan and a support system. And sometimes your support system is something like the LGBT center that will work and help you through that process.
Mhm. Mm.
It's awfully tough, I think, for some of the people that live in smaller towns, because they may be surrounded with people that are not supportive and would just as quick tie you up to a post and beat you up. Unfortunately, we read about that from time to time. So anyway, I think it's very, very important that they have a supportive system around them. I have just been very, very fortunate. I've met great people along the way and made some great friendships. So I have a pretty good, exciting life. Um, and I have opportunity to meet people from all walks of life, from very regular, you know, very regular dudes that just go hang out to some pretty important people. So it's pretty exciting being me, actually. I'm very fortunate. I'm married to a great, fun guy that still forgets that he's not a kid anymore. So that comes with its challenges. But we have a lot of fun together. We love to travel. We love to surround ourselves with people from all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of diversity. So life is interesting. Sometimes I've run out of energy and I have to take a day off, but that's not a bad thing.